What happens when one of the most powerful judges in America tries to shut down one of the boldest voices in Congress? In a courtroom moment no one saw coming, Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor interrupted Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett mid-testimony, trying to silence her fiery words. But what happened next? It shocked everyone. Jasmine didn't back down. She didn't fold. Instead, she delivered a fearless response that left the courtroom speechless, shook the internet, and turned her into a national icon overnight. This isn't just a courtroom clash. It's a moment of truth versus tradition, power versus principle. And trust me, you'll want to see how it all unfolded. The silence was deafening as the gavel slammed and all eyes snapped in front of the courtroom where Judge Sonia Sotomayor sat, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife as she declared, "Order in the courtroom." The energy inside that courtroom was unlike anything anyone had ever felt before, thick, electric, and charged with anticipation. People weren't just there to observe a legal proceeding. They were waiting for something to happen, and they didn't have to wait long. At the center of it all stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, fiery, fearless, and full of conviction. This was supposed to be a simple testimony, a routine part of a much bigger investigation. But everyone in that courtroom quickly realized this moment would become anything but routine. Crockett had only begun speaking when Judge Sotomayor interrupted her with a firm warning, one that made the room go still. But to understand the full weight of that moment, you have to understand what was at stake. The case was centered around governmental overreach, abuse of power, and systemic inequities, and Jasmine Crockett was brought in not as a lawyer, not as a political stunt, but as a voice for the people, specifically for the people who have long felt silenced, ignored, and pushed aside by a justice system that claims to serve them but often doesn't. Crockett walked into that courtroom fully aware that her presence alone was disruptive to the traditional order of things. She wasn't wearing the usual politician's mask. She didn't come in with a carefully crafted, watered-down statement. She came in as she always does, direct, bold, and unapologetically real. And for a courtroom so used to formality, protocol, and rigid decorum, that truth was both powerful and dangerous. As she began her opening remarks, speaking passionately about the disconnect between the law and justice, highlighting the way marginalized voices are routinely shut out of spaces like this one, Judge Sotomayor cut her off. "Ms. Crockett," she said, her tone sharp and commanding, "this courtroom is not a campaign rally. Please keep your statements within legal boundaries." The interruption hit the room like a cold wind. The journalists in the back leaned in. Lawyers exchanged glances. The public gallery, full of activists, citizens, and even former judges, fell silent. Jasmine looked directly at the judge, her expression calm but unwavering, and that's when everything shifted. People expected her to back down, to apologize, to play by the rules of the room. But Jasmine Crockett doesn't fold under pressure. She absorbs it and turns it into power. In that moment, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't show even a flicker of panic. What she did instead was command the room with silence, with presence, with confidence. That moment, the stillness before the storm, was more powerful than anything she could have said. Everyone felt it. The judge, the clerks, the press, even the cameras capturing every angle of this confrontation. Here was a black woman, elected by the people, standing in one of the highest courts in the country, being told to tone it down, to stay in line, to follow the script, and you could see in her eyes that she wasn't to do any of that. This was bigger than one testimony. This was about truth, power, and the cost of speaking out in places where silence is expected. Crockett's presence wasn't just inconvenient. It was disruptive in the most necessary way. The judge might have had the bench, but Jasmine had the people, and that tension lit the courtroom on fire. It was clear to everyone watching that something historic was unfolding. Crockett's voice, though temporarily cut off, carried more weight in that pause than a dozen prepared statements ever could. And as she stood tall, not backing away, not shrinking, the question hung heavy in the air. What happens when someone refuses to be silenced, even by a Supreme Court justice? That was the real drama. That was the moment that captured the imagination of millions watching online, glued to their screens, as the clips started spreading in real time. This wasn't just a legal drama. It was a showdown between tradition and truth, between the rules of the room and the voice of the people. Crockett had turned a courtroom into a battleground for justice, and the opening blow had just been struck. From the gavel to the glare, from the warning to the pause, every second of that first exchange told the story of a system being challenged from within, not with chaos, but with clarity, courage, and conviction. And this was just the beginning. Judge Sonia Sotomayor's interruption wasn't accidental or minor. It was sharp, deliberate, and calculated to send a message. In a courtroom where every word carries weight and every second is governed by protocol, her decision to cut off Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence was more than a procedural correction. It was a moment that revealed the uncomfortable tension between institutional power and unfiltered truth. Crockett had been laying out a detailed, passionate account of how certain communities, particularly Black and brown Americans, have been disproportionately affected by what she called selective justice. She didn't shout. She didn't make it personal. But her tone was raw, and her words hit hard. She referenced case after case, statistics on wrongful convictions, data on police brutality, and how the judicial system seemed designed to maintain control, not deliver fairness. Then came the line that sparked it all. She said, "When justice favors the powerful and silence is demanded from the rest of us, that's not a courtroom. It's a stage for injustice." And that's when Judge Sotomayor leaned forward and fired back. "Ms. Crockett, this courtroom is not a campaign rally. Please keep your statements within legal boundaries." The courtroom froze. There were no outbursts, just a sudden tightening of the atmosphere, as if everyone felt the invisible walls close and around that moment. Crockett paused, her eyes locked with the judge's. And for a brief instant, it felt like history itself was holding its breath. Why did Sotomayor say it? Some argued later that she was trying to maintain decorum. Others believed it was a misstep, a misunderstanding of Crockett's intention. But there were those, many of them watching online, who believed the warning wasn't about courtroom rules at all. They believed it was about control, about silencing a voice that wasn't afraid to say the quiet parts out loud. Because let's be honest, when a sitting congresswoman, elected by thousands of voters, comes into a courtroom and tells the unvarnished truth about inequality, it can shake even the most well-established institutions. And Jasmine wasn't there for drama. She was there to testify on a case involving systemic corruption, where marginalized communities were being targeted by new legislation that critics said would strip them of voting rights and basic protections. So her words weren't random. They were rooted in the facts of the case and backed by lived experiences and legal evidence. Yet still, she was told to tone it down, to follow invisible boundaries. But whose boundaries were those, and who got to decide when the truth was too political? That's the question that started swirling around the courtroom like wildfire. The journalists sitting in the press box immediately picked up on the shift in energy. They leaned closer to their laptops, scribbled notes faster, and some even looked at each other in disbelief. The public gallery, which was already tense, became even more locked in. Phones vibrated in pockets. Eyes darted to the live stream cameras, broadcasting the entire thing to the world. And somewhere in the middle of all that silence and scrutiny, Jasmine Crockett did something extraordinary. She didn't retaliate, didn't raise her voice, and didn't break courtroom protocol. She just stood there, still, calm, present. And in that stillness was defiance, the kind of defiance that says, "I see what you're doing, and I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was deeply powerful. The judge's words had been meant to reassert control, but instead, they became a spotlight, illuminating exactly why Jasmine's testimony was so important in the first place. Because if even in a courtroom, a woman speaking about injustice is too much to handle, then what does that say about the system as a whole? That question lingered in the air, even as the judge tried to move the proceedings forward. It was like a bruise that no one could unsee. And the audience watching from home, they weren't having it. Social media exploded within minutes. Hashtags like hashtag let her speak, hashtag Crockett versus court, and hashtag truth over tradition began trending. Influencers, legal scholars, even other politicians weighed in. Some praised Judge Sotomayor for maintaining order, but the majority of voices online stood firmly behind Crockett, applauding her for standing in truth despite pressure from one of the most powerful legal figures in the nation. It was no longer just a courtroom moment. It had become a national conversation. People weren't asking if Crockett had broken rules. They were asking if the rules themselves were built to silence voices like hers. The reaction was proof of how hungry the public is for authenticity, for leadership that doesn't play by the same sanitized script. And Jasmine Crockett was delivering exactly that. Her confrontation with Judge Sotomayor wasn't violent. It wasn't chaotic. It was a calm collision between two different ideas of justice, one based on order and tradition, and the other based on honesty and lived reality. And for many watching, it was clear which side felt more real. Crockett didn't flinch, didn't stutter, and didn't let the weight of the courtroom break her focus. Instead, what she did next stunned not only Judge Sotomayor, but every single person watching either in that federal courtroom or online through live feeds. After the judge warned her to stay within legal boundaries, there was a pause, and then Jasmine calmly raised her head, looked directly at the judge, and began speaking with a measured, deliberate tone that carried more force than a raised voice ever could. "Your Honor," she began, "with the deepest respect for this institution and your position, I must remind you that I am not here to play politics. I'm here to tell the truth, whether or not it fits neatly into courtroom etiquette." The entire room froze again. What she was doing, respectfully pushing back against a sitting Supreme Court justice, was not just bold, it was unprecedented. She continued, "If the truth makes people uncomfortable, then maybe it's because we've been too comfortable with silence for too long. My constituents didn't elect me to be quiet in powerful rooms. They elected me to speak up in rooms like this." There was no shouting, no theatrics, but every word landed like thunder. Crockett didn't raise her voice because she didn't have to. The intensity of her conviction was enough. Her voice remained steady, but her message hit like a freight train. She talked about the fear felt by mothers watching their sons walk out the door, the weight of history pressing down on people of color who have faced generation after generation of injustice, and how too often the courtroom has served not as a place of justice, but as a gatekeeper of power. She said, "We are told to be polite when discussing injustice. We are told to be respectful when addressing oppression. But justice has never been won by playing small. Justice is achieved when someone somewhere decides to stop whispering and start speaking boldly. Today, that someone is me." The gallery broke courtroom decorum with soft applause before being quickly quieted by security, but the message had already been received. Crockett wasn't just giving a statement. She was delivering a sermon of truth in a room that desperately needed to hear it. Even Judge Sotomayor, who had issued the initial warning, seemed momentarily taken aback. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. For a moment, she sat back in her chair, absorbing the gravity of Crockett's words. You could tell she recognized that this was no ordinary witness. Crockett continued, referencing cases like Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others whose names have become rallying cries for justice. Cases that never even made it to a fair trial or ended without real accountability. She said, "The legal system loves neutrality, but neutrality in the face of injustice is not justice, it's complicity." And when she spoke those words, the courtroom changed. Even the opposing legal team, stoic and stone-faced just moments before, shifted uneasily in their seats. Crockett turned to face the bench again and delivered the line that would later go viral. "If this courtroom cannot handle the truth, then maybe the truth needs a louder microphone." The clip of her saying that was shared millions of times within the next 24 hours. Her team didn't plan it. She didn't rehearse it. It was raw, real, and exactly what millions of Americans have been waiting to hear from someone in power. It wasn't just about politics or law. It was about standing in a place designed to intimidate and refusing to be intimidated. It was about a black woman in power, owning her voice and her purpose, even when facing one of the most powerful judges in the country. The courtroom had become something more than a legal space. It had transformed into a stage for moral confrontation, and Jasmine Crockett stood front and center, holding nothing back. Even after she finished her remarks, the echo of her voice seemed to linger in the air. Nobody could just move on. Nobody could pretend they didn't just witness something profound. Because what Jasmine had done wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a declaration that truth has a place in every room, especially the ones that try to silence it. The judge didn't respond immediately. She sat still, thoughtful, perhaps even humbled, and the silence in the room spoke louder than anything else. Because in that moment, everyone knew that Jasmine Crockett had not only defended her right to speak, she had redefined what speaking truth to power really looks like. As Jasmine Crockett's final words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, the mood inside the courtroom shifted from tension to awe, and for the first time in that hearing, no one dared to speak, not even Judge Sonia Sotomayor. The moment wasn't just powerful, it was transformative. Crockett had done more than defend her right to speak. She had reignited something inside that courtroom, something many people thought had long been buried beneath layers of procedure, legal language, and political formality. And that spark didn't stay confined within those four walls. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, activist supporters and curious citizens watching the live stream on large screens, huddled together in clusters, holding signs that read "Truth Matters" and "Let Her Speak." When Jasmine's viral line, "If this courtroom cannot handle the truth, then maybe the truth needs a louder microphone," hit the feed, the crowd erupted in cheers. The applause echoed through the streets, and within minutes, the video clip started making rounds across every social media platform. On Twitter, the hashtag Crockett Unshaken started trending, followed by hashtag Truth in Court and hashtag She Stood Tall. Influencers, political commentators, and even celebrities shared the clip with reactions ranging from amazement to outright praise. Legal experts appeared on live news panels within the hour, some expressing concern over courtroom decorum, but most applauding Crockett for having the courage to say what so many people have felt but never dared speak aloud. "It's not just what she said," one analyst commented. "It's how she said it, measured, respectful, but absolutely unrelenting." That's the kind of leadership we rarely see inside a courtroom. Inside the building, things were no less explosive. After the silence broke, the hearing continued, but the energy was completely different. It was as if everyone, from the attorneys to clerks, had realized that they were now part of a larger moment in history. Even Judge Sotomayor appeared visibly affected, taking extra moments between questions, appearing more reflective than reactive. She didn't issue another warning. She didn't call Jasmine out again. In fact, she allowed Crockett to complete the rest of her testimony uninterrupted. It was a quiet but significant shift, one that didn't go unnoticed by those watching closely. For her part, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile or show satisfaction. She simply sat down, her presence still commanding the room, letting her words speak louder than any facial expression ever could. And while the courtroom tried to resume business as usual, nothing felt usual anymore. Even the court officers glanced at each other with looks that said, "Did we just witness that?" Back outside, as the hearing adjourned, reporters swarmed the steps of the courthouse, waiting for any statement from Crockett. When she finally emerged, calm, confident, and flanked by staff, the media surged forward. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you think you crossed a line in court today?" one reporter shouted. Without hesitation, Jasmine replied, "If telling the truth is crossing a line, then that line needs to be redrawn." That quote became the next viral moment, plastered on headlines across political news sites, and shared as memes and TikToks by younger audiences who praised her for being the only one brave enough to say what needed to be said. Political commentators on both the left and right chimed in. Some criticized her for pushing back against a Supreme Court justice, but many more defended her as a necessary disruptor in a system that often tries to bury inconvenient voices under rules and rituals. One viral TikTok video with over 10 million views called her the modern-day Sojourner Truth, while another labeled the courtroom moment as this generation's "I am speaking" moment, comparing it to Kamala Harris's famous vice presidential debate retort. Meanwhile, activists and community organizers used the buzz to bring attention to the very issue Crockett was testifying about: systemic inequality in how laws are applied and enforced. Petitions were launched, articles written, and rallies organized in support of her words. What had started as a single tense exchange in a courtroom had now become a national moment of reflection, and for many, a call to action. Even politicians who had previously stayed neutral on the issue began tweeting support, sharing the video with captions like, "This is leadership," and "She said what needed to be said." It wasn't just about Crockett standing her ground anymore. It was about what she represented, an unshakable demand for accountability, honesty, and representation in the very places where those values are often overshadowed by procedure. For Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't about going viral. It wasn't about headlines. It was about doing what she always does, showing up, speaking up, and refusing to be silenced no matter who tries to quiet her. And in that moment, it was clear. She had not just won the attention of a courtroom. She had won the respect of a nation. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the waiter what had just happened refused to leave the room. Judge Sonia Sotomayor remained on the bench for several moments after adjournment, staring ahead in deep thought, while Jasmine Crockett, calm and composed, exited the chamber surrounded by murmurs of disbelief and awe. Outside, the media frenzy intensified, with journalists lined up along the steps, microphones ready, eager to dissect what had just unfolded inside one of the most respected legal institutions in the country. Crockett had entered that courtroom as a guest witness, but she walked out as a national symbol of truth, resistance, and moral clarity. The aftermath wasn't quiet, it was explosive. News stations across the country led with the headline, "Crockett stuns Sotomayor, courtroom moment sparks nationwide debate." Analysts debated whether Crockett had overstepped, but the overwhelming majority of public sentiment was clear. She had spoken truth to power in a way rarely seen, and people were hungry for more of that raw honesty in every corner of American government. On Capitol Hill, several fellow lawmakers spoke out in support of her, with one congressman tweeting, "Jasmine Crockett did what most are too afraid to, challenge power respectfully but unapologetically." And it wasn't just lawmakers. Civil rights leaders praised her as the voice of a new generation, while law professors debated her words in university halls, analyzing what happens when courtroom decorum clashes with the public's right to transparency. Even Judge Sotomayor, known for her thoughtful and reflective approach to the law, released a rare follow-up statement, saying, "While the court must always strive to uphold procedure and fairness, I recognize that passion and lived experience are not distractions. They are crucial perspectives in our pursuit of justice." That single sentence went viral on its own, signaling that even she had been moved by what had taken place. Across TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, clips of Crockett's courtroom moment were racking up millions of views. Her most powerful lines turned into audio tracks, quoted in captions, and printed on T-shirts. Younger audiences were especially energized, calling her the most fearless voice in Washington and the only politician keeping it real. Influencers and podcasters broke down the video frame by frame, explaining why her tone, her body language, and her refusal to be silenced mattered so much in a country where courtroom authority often goes unquestioned. But beyond the viral fame, something more significant was happening, a shift. Crockett's testimony had renewed public attention on the very issues she came to discuss: unequal justice, voter suppression, and political intimidation. Activists launched new campaigns inspired by her message. Nonprofits created awareness toolkits using clips from the hearing, and panels across the country began inviting her to speak. Her words had ignited more than headlines. They had started a movement. School debate teams were quoting her in competitions. Local town halls played her video before discussions on civic rights. She was no longer just a congresswoman. She had become a cultural touchstone. And yet, through all the attention and media buzz, Jasmine Crockett remained focused. In a brief follow-up interview, she said, "I didn't speak to go viral. I spoke because too many people have been told to sit down and be quiet in places like that. I want those people to know that their voices matter, and they belong in every room." That simple message hit harder than anything else, because she wasn't just defending herself. She was defending everyone who has ever been told to stay in their place, everyone who has been talked over, ignored, or underestimated. Her moment in the courtroom became more than a political flashpoint. It became a blueprint for how to lead with courage, how to challenge respectfully, and how to speak powerfully even when you're being told to stop. The court had tried to maintain order, but Jasmine Crockett reminded everyone that real justice requires more than rules. It requires honesty. And for those watching, it was a reminder that the most powerful voice in any room isn't always the one behind the bench. It might just be the one that refuses to be silenced. As the dust settled, one thing was clear. That courtroom would never be the same. Not because of noise, not because of disruption, but because one woman spoke her truth with such clarity and courage that it forced the room and the country to listen. Jasmine Crockett didn't just testify. She testified with fire, with facts, with the kind of fearlessness that demands change. And in doing so, she reminded America what leadership truly looks like. Not scripted, not rehearsed, just real, raw, unapologetic, and unforgettable. When the system tried to silence her, Jasmine Crockett spoke even louder, and the whole country heard it. This wasn't just a courtroom moment. It was a turning point, a reminder that real leadership speaks truth, even when it's uncomfortable. If this moment shook you like it shook the courtroom, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more bold, unfiltered stories that matter. This is State Talk, where truth doesn't whisper, it roars.